This week we'll tackle the topic of theories. We've already learned about some of the theoretical linkages in stress research just from reading chapter 1 of the Carr book, but I've added some sections from a couple of articles this week, both to build out our understanding of the traditional theories used in stress research and a newer theory that's a sort of addition to a modification of the more popular or traditional theories of earlier stress research. The first paper that I've added is written by Carol Annis Hensel in 1992. And a lot of these papers can be quite difficult to get through, especially, I think, for a lower level class. So I do just assign for you to read the overview section. It's on pages 16 to 18 in the article. You're welcome to read any of it that you want, but again, I am only assigning the overview section for you. And in the beginning of this overview, Annis Hensel gives this rather long definition of stress. She starts off by saying it's a state of arousal, right, which is to signify some kind of physical feeling that we get, or psychological stimulation, whether negative or positive, that comes either from socio-environmental demands, that is, things that happen in our physical environment or in our social environment with the people around us, that are taxing, right? That cause this kind of disruption that Carr is talking about in chapter 1. Annis Hensel says also that this state of arousal, that stress, can come from the absence of the means to attain sought-after ends. That is, when there's something that you want, but you don't have what it takes to get that thing, or something is blocking your ability to get the sought-after ends. She distinguishes stressors as external things, right? These kinds of things that make it difficult or impossible for whatever sort of ends you're seeking, things that you're trying to accomplish or achieve or to have or get or feel even, things that frustrate those efforts. And she distinguishes that as being separate from stress, which is an internal thing. It's the thing you feel when there are stressors imposed on you or stressors are present in your circumstances. She talks about a couple of kinds of stressors, and again, Carr gets into this quite a lot in chapter 1 too. But in this older piece, right, 1992, this was published well before the Carr book. Annis Hensel's thinking about the early research and the early thinking on the topic of the stress effects of health. And she's focused in particular on the stress effects on mental or psychological health. So one stressor that she distinguishes is socio-environmental conditions, right? Again, things in the social environment, which of course includes your physical environment, the people and the things that are around you all the time. And these kinds of conditions can be very stressful, as Carr discussed in chapter 1. Some of these things are going to lead to stress for just about everyone exposed to them. And some of these things aren't, because some socio-environmental conditions are things that most people can navigate with relative ease without much difficulty. And therefore, even though they are stressors that we might be exposed to, that internal feeling, the arousal or stimulation, the feeling of stress that can have health effects for us, may not be experienced for a variety of sorts of socio-environmental conditions. Annis Hensel is also talking here a lot about life event change as a stressor. She has a short paragraph where we see life event change being critiqued as a focus of stress research. Even though life event change is something that we can measure, we see that it has happened, or we can ask people and they will tell us that this thing has happened. Often life event change does not show big psychological health effects. And then this is one, again, tying back to the Carr book. Here we're just building on and sort of extending the things that we learn in the Carr book. She talks a lot about these life events. And Carol Anacensal here is borrowing a definition from Bruce Dowenrand for life event changes, an objective occurrence of significant magnitude that changes the usual activities of most persons. So again, that it's objective, that it happened. We can ask people, they can tell us that it happened. And that again is one of the reasons that it had been a big focus of research, because it's easier to get at than some of these other stressors that Carr talks about in chapter 1. And toward the end of this overview section in the Anacensal article, she starts talking about how psychological factors that regulate the impact of stress have gained much attention in stress research. Again, because the stressors that researchers had been looking at didn't necessarily lead to or cause poor psychological or mental health. These researchers then started looking at what are the reasons for that. What is coming along to buffer the impact or to offset the effect of those stressors. And these psychological factors, that social and psychological factors that are regulating the impacts of stress, are important to understand because, again, while some stressors may lead to negative health consequences, that's not been consistently found. Some of them lead to negative health for some people, not for other people. Some lead to certain kinds of negative health and not other kinds, and so on. And so two types of social psychological factors that can offset stress that Anacensal talks a lot about are social support and coping. Social support has been defined in a lot of ways, and there are a lot of things that we mean or that we think about when we talk about social support. So Anacensal talks about how social support, socio-emotional support in particular, is inversely related to many health outcomes. And what it means to be inversely related is that when one is better, the other one is expected to be worse, or we usually find that the other one is worse. So when someone may have greater socio-emotional support, we would expect to find that they had poorer health outcomes. Research also shows that, well, longitudinal research can kind of tease out what's going on and shows that there's this reciprocal or two-way relationship between support and health, which is to say, again, that social support can affect health, but health can also affect social support, right? So that if you have a lot of social support, we expect it to be buffering the stress and making your health better. But on the other hand, if you're in poor health, then the people you know, people in your networks may rally around you and provide additional kinds of support. So that may be why we find lots of support where we find poor health. Research also suggests that perceived emotional support and perceived social support offset the stress effects on mental health, but just being part of a support network doesn't necessarily in itself have that offsetting effect, just being part of a network. And so then she talks about this other form of psychological and social buffering of stress on health, that in the form of coping. And she makes this distinction, as many stress researchers do, between coping behaviors and coping resources, where coping behaviors are, like it sounds, those things we do to cope with stress, to offset the effects of stress on our bodies, on our health, psychological health and physical health. And coping resources are things that are inherent, they're sort of built into us. They're personality types, self-esteem, different things like that, that can have that sort of offsetting effect, that can reduce those the effect of stressors on our health. And she closes this section by stating how coping and social support help to reduce the exposure to stressors and the effects of stress on health. Right, so it's not only that these things can offset the effects of stress on health, but that the more coping behaviors, coping resources, and different kinds of social support we have, the fewer stress exposures we tend to have. So again, a short kind of two-page section by Carol Annis Hensel in that 1992 article. This is something you might need to pull out your dictionary and your thesaurus to read and get through, but it is just a brief section, and I've tried to pull out the main points for you here. I also assigned a very short section in the article by McEwen and McEwen in 2017. This is much more recent than 1992. We're looking here at some authors who are talking about toxic stress, and they're theorizing this to be a biological and neurological link between social circumstances, experiences, and relationships and health. All right, so they're not focused strictly on health. They're saying plus other sociologically important outcomes like socioeconomic achievements, educational attainment, and so on. But in this class, we're focused on the health part, so I'll just mostly highlight what they're saying about the toxic stress effects on health. They're talking about toxic stresses as adverse, negative, bad exposures that are chronic, repeated, and or cumulative, right? These are things that someone might be exposed to repeatedly on a regular basis that might have this cumulative building effect on us, on our biological development, on our neurological development. And they talk about how toxic stress may lead to the development of health behaviors and how it affects the body and the brain throughout life. But the effects of toxic stress, they say, are particularly serious in early life. So their theory, the toxic stress model that they're proposing in this very long paper that, again, I'm only asking you to look at a couple of pages of, their theory here is focused on early life because they, drawing on research from biology and neuroscience and sociology and so on, believe that toxic stress is particularly serious in early life. So toxic stress exposures in early life can come from things like sustained poverty, abuse, and other sources of social disadvantage. In early life, this kind of stress exposure can shape cognitive performance, right? How well we develop the ability to think and to speak, vocabulary, and so on. Self-regulation, right? This is certainly an important thing in young people that carries on throughout life. If young people develop negative or some limited abilities to self-regulate, it leads to all sorts of behavioral problems and academic problems and so on, which can in turn affect health. But that also toxic exposure early in life can have direct consequences for physical and mental health. In their theoretical model, toxic stress exposure in early life also affects these things like social support and coping that should offset the effects of stress, right? That should not only buffer how much stress affects our health, but limits our exposures, right? So that we have fewer exposures to stressful circumstances. So toxic stress exposure is affecting the whole process, if you will, that we've been thinking about and how stress ends up leading to poor health later on. And so McEwen and McEwen here proposed this toxic stress model, and they talk about how it's related to the stress process model proposed by Perlin. And you're going to hear about the stress process model more in the Carr book and other things that we'll read. This has really been Perlin's stress process model has really been the dominant model for decades now, and it has been extended and added to and tested through research in various ways, but continues to dominate even now in stress research. The authors McEwen and McEwen here, they talk about how their toxic stress model is broader than that classic stress process model because it includes more ways that the brain and the body are affected,